The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good evening and welcome. We are presently at the second installment of our study, Contemplating Reality. And sometimes in presenting this, I feel a bit like an adult that's telling the kid, don't worry, if you're going to the dentist, it's going to be okay. And you do that because it is going to be okay. But you also know there's going to be a little bit of discomfort. And I think also Andy Karr in his book accommodates the potential for discomfort. But then again, as you see again and again, also confirmed through the quotes by like Khenpo Tsultrim Gyamtso and so on, it really gives a certainty of what we're doing. It lends the dimension of hard science or hard logic, hard intelligence to what we're doing. So it gives peace of mind with regards to the path. So it is very important to really, of course, you could say enlightenment is not the rational mind, but at the same time, to have some certainty about what we're doing in terms of our rational common sense is very valuable. So we'll begin without further ado. So in the present context, then it's always tradition to start off with some venerating principle of Manjushri or the in this case the teachers of the author. So we do that. I pay homage to the ocean of Dharma, who is Chögyam Trungpa. I pay homage to the ocean of ethics, Khenpo Tsultrim Gyamtso. I pay homage to the ocean of qualities, Jamgon Contra Lodatayan. And paying homage to the oceans of compassionate ones who open the Dharma gate. So just to look back at what we did last time, which is identifying the problem, our delusion, the problem that we impute snake on what in fact is a rope. So the point is that we are projecting onto something. And in chapter 2, then we discussed the remedy which is the Dharma, studying the teachings. And approaching the teachings, then we're well equipped if we realize the various Buddhist teachings, they come in with three different perspectives. And these are referred to as the three turnings of the wheel. And also there's four tenets, four gradually increasingly sophisticated ways of looking at reality and discerning reality. And then chapter 3, Andy Karr presented how we could contemplate, the way that we contemplate. And this we return to in the context of the study also. So this is systematically looking at things and thinking about it. It's very much employing the rational mind, but using the quality of the rational mind to discern what is not real and what is real. So we established that the problem is this fixating on a self. And the Buddha's discovery was selflessness. Now, there's a text that I've been promoting a little bit. It's an academic text, and it comes with all the equipment of an academic text, references to contemporary research and so on. And it comes from the field of mindfulness studies, wellness, what we call phenomenology. And it establishes two ways that we could psychologically handle experience. It's taken from practice, from people's practice, where some people they really validate and prioritize self-centering, strong boundaries against others, and others, they have very much the sense of empathy and identifying with others, and their own well-being is secondary or somewhat secondary. So these two approaches, they of course exist within the practice of our life experience. But this paper, which is then written by Matthew Ricard and another French academic, Michael Dambrun, explores how various, within the field then of psychology and these fields of mindfulness and so on, research identifies what these two styles of psychological organization, what this does in terms of well-being, in terms of happiness. So of course here we're coming with hardcore logic, but there is also then the studies within then this field that reflect what we are talking about here. So when we say selflessness, this entails looking at our being, our mind with its sense of self. And we have to probably agree that nothing is more close to us. There's the inseparability of the object and the subject, really, in this case. And what's also curious is that generally, and this is of course why we're sitting here, we generally have no conclusive understanding of this self or the mind. That's the common experience for most of us. So in doing this, let's just be clear, we're not doing philosophy as something abstract, otherworldly, and in any way removed from us. It is getting right down to where the pebble in the shoe is. This is immediate. But of course, this is something universal, so we can't talk about it in terms of specifics, how I was this morning or what's going to happen next week and so on. It's something that runs throughout all aspects of our existence. So it has this universal quality, obviously. But in here then, Andy Karr, he identifies how we don't have any conclusive understanding, and very often we would say, I am sick. See, we say, I am sick, as if I and the sickness is one. Then we would say, I have a headache, and then it's objectified as something external. These just reflect that really there's no sense of clarity about the self's role with regards to perception and so on. So we have this lovely incident in the life of Milarepa, where there's a young man who approaches Milarepa and he asks for teachings, and Milarepa then questions him about, please let me know, what is your mind like? And he then has a long reply, at the end of which he then concludes, I have no idea what the mind is, which is such a beautiful place to begin. So the nature of this inquiry is that we won't find anything, but we also needn't be confused, because this is not about finding something. It's more that we want to find out that we're operating from a flawed premise, which is the existence of the self. And so that's why, to really drive this point home, we have a very structured inquiry and analysis then, which is really key in Buddhist methodology. So first we need to identify that we do indeed experience a strong sense of me, and that's where we have the notion of singularity. We generally have a sense of being the same person continuously, right? Not shifting into being another or other persons. Like he says, we don't go to bed saying, okay, I was Judy today, but maybe I'm going to try to be Julie tomorrow. We have a sense that it was Jakob yesterday, it's Jakob today, it will be Jakob tomorrow, right? Independence. There is the impression that we make choices independently. I want, and so on. Of course, these are all up for discussions and so on, but this is generally how we operate. I'm going to decide things. Permanence. We decide the self as something that's lasting. Yeah, there's me looking out for number one. And importance. And Karr says self-importance is the undercurrent to all our activity. self-centering. And then also he says, we're usually so absorbed in our own agenda that we can't even imagine anyone else having anything important to do. He gives the example of commuters that are late and they don't really give a damn about other people being late. The fact that they're stressed heightens this sense of self-importance. Now, we should be clear that this is a problem. Self-centering is a problem. We can make a lot of arguments for it. Clearly, our prickliness, our fussiness, and so on is always there. Our choosiness, our censorship, and so on, our refusal to go along with certain things, our insistence on other things, and so on. And on the basis of this, we have so much suffering. Outer enemies, they can really only harm us in limited degrees. They could ultimately kill us, yes, but the inner enemy of this clinging to the self, that lives on. And so we want to recognize that the real cause of our suffering lies within. This is not just that we're doomed, this also comes with a strong sense of empowerment. We can do something about it. But let's be clear, from this notion of self, with all its fuzziness, prickliness, and so on, as much as we might successfully succeed in eking out moments of satisfaction and gratification, it ultimately leaves us with this insecurity of we don't really know what's happening to us. And ultimately we have what we call in the Buddhist tradition, the four great waves of sorrow, which is birth, old age, sickness, and death. From the notion of self comes a lack of joy. Ego is caused. Our ego comes from an ignorant place. It comes from a confused place. And on the basis of that, then we have all the strategies of the ego and the patterns of these. So as this Geshe, Gelik Rinpoche, he says in this work that Andy Karr quotes, good life, good death, how this ego doesn't just come out of the blue. And as soon as we have that ego, then we also have this sense of importance. And when we have, for example, a cup that all of a sudden becomes my cup, then somebody drinks from my cup, then we have strong sense of, well, what ordinarily was just a cup, as soon as it's appropriated with the label mine, then we have all of this trouble. My this, my that, my property. So this, of course, then extends to our body, particularly, naturally. Then we have my country, we have my religion, and my sect. Now, of course, in the modern context, we have a lot of deconstruction and we have a lot of relinquishing of traditional values around things like country and religion and so forth, but the my persists. And however much we theoretically might sort of dispute the validity of that, then it's something that sits very deep in us. So we want to be clear that we can, with these four assertions of singularity, independence, what was it? Permanence and importance. With that, then we know, and in this discussion we're clear on that. We know that how the self appears and what it effectively does. So we should now look at what we can actually do, and that is basically look at this assumption, and we're going to assess whether the central role we attribute to the self and the assumption that are basic to its existence can be validated. Now we're going to be employing two methods. One is the Vibhashika, which looks at the object, and the other is the Sutrantika, that more looks at the subject. One is looking at the snake and the rope, and the other is looking at the looker and seeing what in fact is happening with that phenomenon out there where we're imputing something we're projecting snake onto a rope, when in fact that is only a projection. There is nothing, no snake. So that's what the Sutrantika does, works with the observer. So one is looking at the object and one is looking at the subject. It is going back to the insistence that this is not hard. This is this is basically what we're doing. But of course, we are operating within logic, and also we're operating within a foreign kind of logic. And I would say, as far as these existing works that present these logic and so on, this book is very gentle. But also, I would like to say, don't fear not the less gentle works, because that logic there can be very helpful if we have an analytical mind. Very helpful. So we are sort of being eased in also with the references and the very quotes we're being introduced. Here's a quote from The Way of the Bodhisattva, chapter 6, which is about the patience. And very often when we are impatient, there's a very keen sense of me. And that's where we want to look at that. From the absolute point of view, we would say this self, quote from Shantideva then, this self, if permanent, is certainly impassible, like space itself. And should it meet with other factors, how should they affect it, since it is unchanging? That's what we sometimes would like to think, right? If when things occur, it stays unchanged and as before, what influence has action had on it? They say that this affects the self, but what connection could there be between them? So then, if everything, we have those who would say, oh, but the self is just, vast, it's all one, then why the anger, why the reaction, and so forth? So going from the level of the great philosophical assumption down to the practical application and the actual experience, then we can say this idea of the self being something great permanent is ultimately something absurd. It's completely changing. And were it to be unchanging, then nothing would really affect it. That's an example of Buddhist logic. Think of it. It's true. But then again, it's very different from the sort of vague philosophy we sometimes have. In Denmark, we talk about something we call pocket philosophy, which is just sort of sitting around and shooting the breeze and a bit of philosophy and making sort of vague statements, great truths perhaps, but still with no real commitment. And when we're looking at things like that, we actually need to make a commitment. Yes, if we're saying one thing, then it's inconsistent if it doesn't hold up, right, in a logical context. That's where we begin to smell the rat, that something's not quite right. And that's where we begin to identify the problem with this enemy within. So when we talk about self then, which is clearly not something that is permanent, then what is it then? Well, we can talk about two kinds of self. We can talk about the imputed self, and that's what we have in relational, philosophical, and religious concepts. Relational is all the sense of me that comes from interacting with others, dad, lover, employee, customer, etc. Then we have philosophical, the sense of being, and so forth. And then we have the religious concepts, the soul, and so forth. So these are ideas. They exist culturally or educationally produced ideas of the self. Then we have the instinctive self, the basic sense of existing as a separate self. And that's where Andy Karr, he refers to the grunt level of feeling I exist. And that's basic to us, to earthworms, to snakes, dolphins, crocodiles, gods, hell beings, hungry ghosts, etc., etc., etc. All of them have this basic sense of me. Happy if I get what I want, unhappy if I don't. So it's the reality of this self, both the imputed and the instinctive self, that is challenged by the Buddhas and the sages. And we can see then through their effectively freeing themselves of that, then the experience of bliss. So we need to go into then looking at this self that we apparently seem to think is for real. So that's where we could analyze then. We could ask, is this self the body, or is it the mind? Is it both of these, or is it neither of them? Now, most people, they would say, "Oh yeah, I'm both body and mind." And of course, also in Buddhism, yes, we operate with that conventional perception. The skandhas is essentially body and mind, psychophysical aggregation, as we call it, right? But let's see. So if we say, is the self both body and mind? That would be difficult, because the self is the self, right? Actually, the mind and the body, they have no shared ground. One is physical and one is mental, entirely intangible. Where does the self stand? How could it be both? These two things have nothing in common. So if we look, it's not like if we say we have a machine, yes, then it has all made out of parts. If it's something that's entirely intangible, so let's say of my aspirations for world peace, there's nothing tangible about it. So for the self to be both body and mind, think about it. Doesn't work. Not possible. Don't worry about that. Just think of it. Let it sit there and annoy you. That's okay. This is all. This is where the dentist drilling. That's about as painful as it gets. It's just going to sit and nag. And what we want to basically do is undermine the assumptions around the self. No, don't worry. We can't find we can't find it, right? Hence, also difficult to validate the idea of a solid, unchanging self. Okay, then we could say, is the self only mind? Well, in that case, then we would have no body. We would be entirely immaterial. Yeah, some sort of a funny idea that that our real being is entirely without any body. Mm-mm. Doesn't happen. We have a body, undeniably. Otherwise, then I should, like he says, I stub my toe and it'll be fine. I'm just mind. Very much. Even in dreams, we have body. Let's just be clear. When we're talking about in Buddhism, we're talking about nature of reality. We generally talk about the physical aspect too. Body, speech, and mind. They are there in samsara. They're there in nirvana. It's the nature of our reality. Again, nothing that we can pinpoint in terms of self. So we can't say the self is only mind. It's the self only body. Well, and that's also typical Buddhist reasoning. In that case, then the corpse. If there's the body is there, okay. Well, then the corpse will be the self, right? Is the self neither body nor mind? Could we have a self with neither? Also not. So of course nowadays what we have, and this is really what sits and nags at the modern Buddhist, which is this notion, and Andy, he quotes Francis Crick, who famously then says, "You, your joys and your sorrows, your memories and your ambitions, your sense of personal identity and free will are in fact no more than the behavior of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules." Now, this comes from somebody who received the Nobel Prize in physics. He developed an understanding of the DNA, as far as I gather. And also, this is generally what people nowadays would subscribe to. But the thing is, neuroscience and the sciences in general do not have any conclusive understanding of what the consciousness is. This, of course, was pronounced, proudly and many will subscribe to it, but it is actually not substantiated. It's about as real as the value of bloodletting, or the idea of the, what's it called, the anthropocentric universe, that the Earth stands at the middle of the universe because the Pope says so, and all the cardinals, they say so. Yeah, this is valid until another view comes along and possibly disproves it. So we don't have any substantial science for that position. We have a lot of subscribers to it. One problem is, how would you say something that is completely immaterial and intangible, like consciousness, with all its irrational quirks, how that would emerge as an emergent property of something that doesn't have consciousness? Apart from that, as Tonsa Khenpo will also say, if the thing about the robots, if robots have real minds, well, he says, if one day the robots, they go ahead and they have neurosis, if they are unhappy and have neurosis, now that would be a sign of having a mind, having Buddha nature. Anyway, so this is an important point, really, that we establish that the self does not exist in any way in any of these four options. So as we're investigating, we should do this. So of course, normally when we have these kind of like things that are not clear, then just forget it. And isn't there some scientist that we can subscribe to? Isn't there some great guru who we can subscribe to? And that's the path of faith, which is fine, but it can be very simple, and it very often doesn't generate a lot of engagement. So it's just like, I don't want to think about it. And that's where faith can be very convenient, as in terms of the ego, doesn't really want to know. We just sign a dotted line. We don't want to know. And we can't really attain liberation like that. We need to get to the bottom of this. And when we begin to see what it is that drives confusion and that we can remove it, that's where the path really gains its value. Then we begin to actually cure. If we don't do anything, it's just like whatever, then we just sort of stay endlessly in this undecided condition. So we look, and we can then investigate. And the thing about this self, then, if you like, if we're going to have some assertion here, is that yes, it has no reality apart from being an appearance. Now, this is the point. It appears, it seems to function, and so forth, just like a dream. So just like in a dream, everything functions and follows a logic, then also, yes, the self appears, but it has no reality. And he quotes the Vijayadhara, the Venerable Gyamtso Rinpoche, who says, these experiences are space, different versions of space. It seems intense and solid, but in actual fact, it isn't at all. There are different aspects of space. That's the exciting or interesting part. In fact, it is complete open space, without any colors or particular solid way of relating. So the nature of what we're experiencing is this appearance, just like in a dream, that is intangible, and yet there is appearance. But it doesn't in any way exist apart from being constructions, and the assumption of the self is something that, if we look, we cannot find. So we're looking at space. We're not denying anything. We're not denying any appearances. We're not denying the existence of the Pentagon, or or Mount Everest. It seems intense and solid, right? But it isn't. And if we look into physics, nuclear physics, quantum mechanics, and so forth, we of course are confirmed in our appreciation that there is nothing that seems to be as solid as it appears. The contemplation that we want to take with us here is, we have taken what is not a self to be a self. The thing is, of course, we have thoughts, And we very often have fall back on Descartes, for example, who said, what is it again? Cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I exist. But we could really just say there are thoughts, and I can conclude then that I can think. That doesn't necessarily mean that there is a self. There's a cognitive quality, but apart from the cognitive quality, there's no essence of it. To assume that is a bit like coming in and assuming that there is the potter around. If we come into a workshop, Andy gives this example, we come into a studio and there's the potter's wheel with a half-finished vase on it, and then we assume there is a potter, but that's an assumption. So finally, as more looking into the actual problem is then that with the sense of self, then it is like Chandrakirti, he says in the introduction to the Middle Way. First thinking of me, they cling to self. Then thinking this is mine, attachment to things develop. Beings are powerless, as in an irrigation wheel. I bow to compassion for these wanderers. So in India, you can see these irrigation wheels. I'm afraid Ari Goldfield's translation might have, he's a good translator, but here I must say, I think we just be clear, it's an irrigation wheel. And that, because irrigation wheels, as the water keeps running, it just keeps going around and round. And that sense of me and mine, that is what takes beings to wander in samsara. Okay, we'll see if there's any questions. Is it correct to say that Buddhist logic is not asserting that it can prove that no essential self exists, rather that it is impossible to establish that it does exist? No, it does operate with proof. Basically, the logic is that anything that is a construct, which clearly self is, anything that is conditioned, which self clearly is not unconditionally existent. Right? That's a proof. Yeah, so it does operate with proof. Yeah, we're looking more at this. Actually, this is what comes next, and then we need to ask ourselves, why do we believe so strongly in something that cannot be established to exist? Yes, that applies exactly. So we can very clearly establish selflessness, but we also very clearly then face the paradox, or rather the recognition we are deluded. And yes, then we need to ask ourselves why that happens. We're going to be looking at why that happens. Yeah. Chapter 5, Vibhashika, taking things apart. Jitakmawa, those who look at divisions, meaning looking into categories and identifying the constructed nature of things. So these 4 tenets we looked at before, right? We have Vibhashika, this is the first, and we're going to have Sutrantika. And then we're going to have Yogacharya or Chittamatra, and the last one is Madhyamika. So these offer increasingly profounder ways of demonstrating selflessness and establishing the nature of reality. Now, as much as we can demonstrate selflessness, we can prove selflessness, we actually don't go along and then prove reality other than that we say it's beyond conceptual constructs. And as much as we can assess certain logical validations with regards to what we could call emptiness, we also recognize that ultimate emptiness is ultimately something that is beyond the reach of the intellect. Like Shantideva says, the absolute is beyond the scope of the ordinary intellect. So in doing so then, and all of the various tenets, they operate with selflessness, but they see selflessness in different ways. So we have in the Vibhashika and the Sutrantika, very much the notion that we still have space, we still have time. In the Mahayana, then we actually don't even assert the existence of any of these. So that's where we talk about great emptiness. And while so selflessness runs through these, we would say even something doesn't have a self, it's still the parts are there, still exist in terms of time. Then the Mahayana view is that there's this entire absence of anything that can be objectified or said to have any true existence. So they become increasingly more profound. And each of these tenets then approach this in different ways. So, like I said, Vibhashika is very much going to be looking at the object, the Sutrantika more at the subject. And this practice of deconstruction then enables us to see the nature of reality. We know that when we when we refuse to acknowledge complexity, then we mistake. When we rush to a simple judgment about something, we very often fail. And it's really only through understanding all the aspects of something that we begin to have an understanding. And very often it takes us to a place where we actually are very cautious about making judgments, about making assertions and so on. You could say that is the non-violent nature of the Buddhist teaching, the non-aggression, is this not fixating. Anyway, so Vibhashika takes things apart, and like Andy Karr says, when he was a kid, he loved to take things apart. Actually, if we read the life of the Dalai Lama, he also loved to take things apart, like his watches and so on. And the Dalai Lama and Andy Karr would be able to put things together again. I'm not sure if I'm in that category. I remember taking things apart. Don't remember if I could get them together again. Anyway, this is, of course, when we begin to have a proper, clear understanding of how things taken apart are, then also, yes, we understand the relative nature of their functionality. So, Vasubandhu says in the Abhidharma Kosha, if something is physically destroyed or mentally broken down, the mental state that apprehended it does not engage in it anymore. Something like a vase or water exists seemingly, while what exists genuinely is something other. So we do have the images of, say, a rainbow that might seem to be there. We follow to the end of the rainbow, we never catch it. We might have a dream or a hallucination and so forth. So these things, they seem to exist. I seem to have, a phone here, right? But in fact, if I mentally break it down, as it says here, deconstruct it, then what genuinely exists is something other than the phone. What genuinely exists is actually the absence, the emptiness, and if you like, according to the Vibhashika, the atoms, the fine particle. They assert that. So Trungpa refers to these as the atomists. So that's what happens when we put things under a microscope. Yeah, then we realize that things don't really exist as they appear. So we have to understand that. Then we also meditate on impermanence. So we meditate on the impermanence of the continuum, which is what we can observe in ourselves, in other people, and so on. As we get older, we age, and all of that. Things come undone, our new car, all of a sudden it's 5 years old, it's 10 years old, and so forth. It comes undone. And then we have subtle impermanence, which is that continually things are changing. Like somebody was saying, we can actually, if we think of it, then the person that we had lunch with last week, and then we have lunch again this week, not the same person actually. And that's where you understand everything is continually shifting. So this is where we want to be very clear that there is no unchanging self, an unchanging phenomena. And so we look at various examples. For example, a candle. The candle that we look at now, and then again, candle in an hour's time. If we look at the physical laws about that, it's just the gases that have been consumed, and the material in there is gone. So subtle impermanence is that continual changing of phenomena. And the Vibhashika, they then make a point that we of course have that. We have what's called unexamined, and this is all the way through actually the Buddhist logic and the notion of relative truth and absolute truth. Unexamined, yeah, things appear as they do, but that's also where we get fooled. But sure, conventionally unexamined things, they're there. But the thing is, if we begin to ask these questions with analysis, that's where we begin to things disappear in front of us. So that's with regards to objects, and Karr quotes then, or says, according to the Vibhashika, each of these moments is genuinely real. The collection of these moments is just a concept that is imputed by thought. Taking apart our experience like this helps separate our ideas about the way things appear from what is genuinely real. So the Vibhashika, they say moments of time are real. So when we have a collection of these moments, then yes, then we have a whole assemblage, then we have an object. But there are parts in this, and that's where the Vibhashika, they attribute existence to short moments of time. We could do the same analysis to our thoughts. Now, for example, if we have the thought, I would like to have lunch, if we follow this notion of time, then we can see that it consists of many smaller instances. First, there's the sense of I, the hunger abides here, and then lunch, would like, and then it's obviously more than just the linguistic thought, the linguistic construction that runs through our mind. It's also that it comes, that sense of smaller instances, so that we can do. And in fact, it applies both to the body and the mind, that we won't find any enduring essence. So that's a way of deconstructing. So every moment has components of micro moments. And of course, we impute some sort of like overarching reality to it, like our lives. It's just a lot of little instances, you know. I'm gonna have something on my tombstone, you know, and that will say Jakob, Leschly, and you know, some dates, and then you think, oh yeah, that was that was a moment. But the thing is, there's a sense that was a whole life, right? In fact, it's just all these instances. This we can analyze, and it's also, like I said, don't get stuck with the Danish approach of pocket philosophy. Gain certainty. Don't leave it vague. So to bring it back to the intuitive, and Trungpa Rinpoche is extraordinary in identifying how we in the modern world, we identify truth and sort of what we click with. He then says in one of his, or in a collection actually of his teachings that are called Heart of the Buddha, we think we are great, broadly significant, and that we cover a whole large area. We see ourselves as having a history and a future. And here we are in our big deal present. But if we look at ourselves clearly in this very moment, we see we're just grains of sand, just little people concerned only with this little dot, which is called nowness. And he also says then in Cutting Through Spiritual Materialism, according to the Buddhist tradition, the spiritual path is the process of cutting through our confusion, of uncovering the awakened state of mind. The heart of the confusion is that man has a sense of self, which seems to him to be continuous and solid. When a thought or emotion or event occurs, there is a sense of someone being conscious of what is happening. you sense that you're reading these words. This sense of self is actually a transitory, discontinuous event, which in our confusion seems to be quite solid and continuous. Since we take our confused view as being real, we struggle to maintain and enhance this solid self. So there's a place where we're struggling. We are having a continual experience of insecurity. And that's why we assert ourselves and try to set ourselves apart from the other and identify a vivid experience of solidity. Okay, I'm just going to take questions. In chapter 5, the Vibhashika view presents faith as a created mental state, a virtuous mental state, as part of the skandha formation. So faith too is an example of a transitory aggregate. Better practice while I can. Yeah, well, yes, of course. Or you could say the mind is all the various states of mind, whatever it has, they're all transitory states. But we're stuck in it, right? We're stuck in the dream. So we're making this experience of self a vehicle, and that is what we do with the path. It's a vehicle that carries us across the ocean of confusion. So we are using, on the relative level, we are using the mind, virtuous mental states, yes. But there's also a place that's the vipassana and the greater insight, which is ultimately where we begin to see through the hoax. And that's the vipassana that is beyond then the constructs. That is leaving the mind in its natural condition. And that's then the vipassana. So the skillful means of the path takes the mind as a vehicle, and the wisdom of the path is then aligning ourselves with the reality of our absolute nature, the greater perspective of no self. Regarding the klesha consciousness and the alaya, would you say a little bit more about these? I wonder which schools conceive these and why, and also whether the Western psychological view of the subconscious are comparable. Well, yes, we're going to get to that, but just very briefly, this is Yogacarya, and indeed, the subconscious is associated more with I think, the seventh consciousness, but we'll look at that. Yeah. So, this is where, coming back to body and mind, the self, again, is not found in any of these aggregates, but with the skandha of form, there's all of a sudden a sense of me, distinct from the other. Then we have the skandha of feeling we perceive and yet is already beginning to be frozen. Then we have the skandha of discriminations or perceptions, this being this being that. And on the basis of it being good and bad, then we have impulse and we have experience, which is consciousness. So all of that together gives a sense of self, but it is in fact just aggregation. As soon as something is aggregation, then it doesn't have an essence. That's the proof of no self, if you like, the logical proof. What we need to do is assert the logical proof so that it becomes the foundation for then the experience. We can, for example, take it into life and, you could say, interact free of self-interest and discover that actually feels good. Again, I'm not talking about unhealthy, crazy, material practices, but just relaxed, spacious, random acts of kindness. It feels good. The practice of compassion feels good. Okay, just in terms of what we strictly speak in terms of the definitions, then the skandha of forms then includes the five sense faculties and their objects. That's where there's a sense of self and there's a sense of the perceptions. There's then the skandha of feelings, the sensations, Vedana. This consists of all the pleasant and unpleasant and indifferent sensations already there. There's a self that has a clear sense of what is acceptable or pleasant and what is not. Then there's skandha of discriminations or perceptions. This includes all clinging to characteristics, qualities, distinguishing features. It's basically where we begin to have that we begin to label things. And then we have the skandha of formations, all thoughts like ideas, concepts. This is more organized. This is where these skandhas are not just vague, but they become very institutionalized. Thoughts, emotions, and the mental states, what we talk about, the 51 mental states. So on the basis of that, then we have the experience, the overall experience of consciousness. And this is then when we experience, then we have a knowing, there's a clarity, there's a knowledge of the objects. And this is what we carry with us. So we're conscious beings. This consciousness is founded on these skandhas. The sense of self is founded on these skandhas. And that's where he gives the example that we can do this triage with loose change. And if we sort of run all this through if we think there's a self in all of this, we put all the change of these 5 skandhas into the teller, the automatic teller in the bank, and it should then all of a sudden the thing that wasn't counted that comes out at the end, like if we have foreign change, then we should find some self. We don't. And so that's where then we appreciate this being what we call a transitory collection, or what is it again? A disintegrating collection. So what we have is something that we assert solidity as real. We very often, also in the Madhyamika, we say, for example, you have a car, or cart traditionally. All the various parts, yes, we attributed the name cart or car, vehicle. But in fact, it's just many, many different objects. And each of these little parts, they're not the cart itself, and so forth. Main thing here is that we begin to analyze here. So just that we're clear then we have these, the consciousnesses. So we generally talk about the 6 consciousnesses, where in addition to the 5 the faculties, 5 objects, external objects, then also we do refer to the mind that knows as the mental consciousness. So then we add to that then the klesha, or the disturbed mental consciousness, which is the subconscious, the place where there's the ego. And also to some extent we can refer to the alaya as the subconscious, because that's where all the impressions lie. But all the impressions, they're more just there. Whereas the alaya is the one that's more based on the sense of me and my ego and so forth. So that's where there's more the trauma and all the afflicted conditions that operate. So Andy says the consciousness are like our shifting awareness of different parts of the display. The basic point is that they're not as solid things, but a continuously disintegrating, groundless display. So notice that we have eye sense consciousness, ear sense consciousness. When we have these moments of consciousness, and consciousness in the Tibetan Nampar Shepa, it means knowing something that has a characteristic. Nampa, Vijnana, knowing something, the knowledge of a thing. And that is then what we see, what we hear, what we smell, what we taste, the tactile sensations, and then also thoughts. We know them too. We call that the 6th consciousness or the 6th sense, but it's not anything you could say occult. It's just knowing the mind. And so similarly also then this is driven by, very often our condition is driven by, we need to recognize that, some other consciousnesses, which is then the mental consciousness that is surrounded around the self, and that's all the kleshas. And then the alaya, or the all-basis consciousness, is the ground, it's actually the very place where samsara originates. It's the unconsciousness. That's like when we fall asleep, all of a sudden, boom, we're gone. And similarly also, we And we fall into samsara just out of unconsciousness. And that ground there is the same place as the Buddha's enlightenment. It's the same place as our awakened potential. But all of a sudden is not known. It's mistaken, and hence it becomes that vast sunlit sky loses the light. And that's what samsara is. But that we refer to as the all basis or the all consciousness. Let's see. Okay, I'm probably going to go until yeah, go over time. Let's see how far we go. Regarding the klesha consciousness and the alaya, could you say a little more on these? Oh yeah, that's what we did that. Okay. I have lost the screen with the text in Jakob's video. Now I have to say that these things happen. Some of us sometimes lose the video and so on, and usually it comes back. If not, then if not, there is there is actually a 800 number. People supply this software. If you have continued problems, let me know. But very often it seems that these things do come back. From my end, I always, before I do these, I check if the broadband speed is sufficient. And right now I have 50 megabytes upload speed, which some of you will know is more than plenty. So from this side, it should be okay. So the point really is, again, what Andy says, the more we look, the clearer it is that our experience is composed entirely of these constantly disintegrating collections. We don't find any possessor of the collections. Because of this constant shiftiness and lack of solid landing place, we experience a very subtle and pervasive state of agitation, restlessness, or dissatisfaction that is woven into the basic fabric of our experience. And that is then where we have what is called all-pervasive suffering. That this is at the level then of the klesha, but also it's sort of knowing the condition of the alaya as well. It's discomfort that the ego always experiences, because there's never ever a sense where the ego is at ease. So then we have one of the really dense texts that bring home the point about the lack of self, the fundamental wisdom of the middle way, Mula Madhyamika Karika. And in here then, the great Indian sage Nagarjuna says, if the self were the aggregates, it would be something that arises and ceases. If the self was something other than the aggregates, it would not have the aggregates' characteristics. So, if there was a self in the aggregates, then the self would be something that arises and ceases. Then there wouldn't be any sense of continuity. There wouldn't be any sense of, what is it we have? Independence, permanence, etc. As we saw before with Shantideva, it would be completely unchanging. No, it would be something that would never be, in that it would be something that is continually shifting. There wouldn't be a sense of it being this solid self. So the self is not the aggregates. If the self was something other than the aggregates, then we wouldn't have all the things the aggregates have, which is all the perceptions, the sense of feeling, and all the things that make up us. So again, we cannot find anything solid about the aggregates. Sorry, we cannot find anything solid about the self. So, Andy says, since the self seems to be one thing, the aggregates can't be the self, right? So that's with regards to the first two lines. And on the other hand, if the self were a completely different thing from the aggregates, we should be able to observe such a self directly, but we don't. We cannot see anything outside of ourself. and not anything external. It's important we make this. This is intended to be contemplated. So you're not having the sort of the answer served up. You're getting contemplations here. Want to look, think about it, and hopefully it gnaws. We go to the dentist, still gnawing a bit. But the thing is, we're doing something profoundly important, and so the process is essential, and it provides ultimately a value of certainty. Khenpo Tsultrim Gyamtso says in regards to this, he then says, in just this way, if this hesitant questioning is supplanted by a firm conviction that the self, which is grasped at as the personal identity of the aggregates, is nothing but a mere imputation, and if one becomes accustomed to this, the absence of self will be directly experienced. To this end, it is said in the teachings that one should ask oneself where this sense of I arises, where it is located and abides, and where it subsides. In accordance with this instruction, after making a thorough investigation, one should simply rest in the state of finding nothing. When one is unable to continue with this, one should proceed with the former analytical meditation. These two types of meditation should be practiced alternately. So first we analyze, and then we settle into the just settling, resting. And then again we analyze and we rest. These two styles of meditation are referred to as Chegom and Jogom, analytical meditation, resting meditation. So we do this alternately when we're practicing analytical meditation, and also at one point then we just practice settling meditation. But to really have this certainty, which we call the certainty of the view, this analysis is essential. I tell you, there's no way we will never get away from this. But at the same time, there is what you have here pretty much, the analysis that we've done here, and the notion of looking at where the I arises, where it abides, where it goes. These are really key elements in the analytical approach. So if we're analytical, and we come from an analytically, inclined culture, then if we need stuff to think about, this is what we can think about. If we need to analyze, then this is it. Chapter 6, Sotrantika. What really comes to mind? So here we're going to be looking more at the observer. So we looked at the self and you could say the objective nature of the self without being able to find anything. Now we're going to look at something that we do when we observe and when we conceptualize. We're going to look at two things, which is percept and concept, perception and conception. And this constitutes what we in Buddhism, well, this is, you could say the previous one is what falls under the category of what we in the West call ontology, trying to understand the factual nature of things, how things are. And now we're looking at epistemology, which is how do we know what we know? How do we know if we know about something, what it is? How do we know that we know that? How can we validate our knowledge? And that's where we look at one thing that we call perception, which are the actual specific objects that can perform a function. This is associated then with what we'll see is what we call specifically characterized phenomena. That is my cow Hazel. This is my cow Hazel, she's right out there. And then we have something else. Conception, abstract images that enable understanding but which cannot perform. Generally characterized phenomena. And that is if I'm, for example, sitting discussing the issues of what modern cows have to put up with. Then we're talking about cows in general. These are not cows we can go and milk. We can't actually touch them. They're just concepts. But they are seen as real. And when I then look at Hazel, I'm actually imputing my version of cow onto Hazel. So that's where there's something taking place, where we could say we don't actually, and this is also something we work with in Western epistemology, that do we really see the object? And the issue here is, where does our projection get in the way for actually seeing the actual thing? And that's where we realize that we are projecting snake onto a rope, is because we have an idea, we have a subconscious worry about snake. And so then as we're walking along, the snake area, then we see a rope, then right away we're projecting our fear of snake onto what in fact is just an object, a perfectly normal rope lying there, and that can perform a function. But that snake that I'm projecting onto the rope, that's not a snake. It can't bite, can't do anything. It cannot perform. So here we also associate this with the relative and absolute truth, where we would say the relative truth, that's the rope, if you like. That's the absolute. That's what is actually functioning, actually there, the actual cow. But the relative truth is just a generic image, and that's where we very often project onto something which prevents us from seeing it properly, and that's where we miss absolute truth. That's where we impute self where there is no self. So just to bring home, and that's really Andrew Carr's main point here, is to distinguish between these two, between perception and conception, and that we're clear on that. This is such a helpful tool in terms of us dealing with our reality. So we can say then the perceiving of a sound might enable our conceptual mind to determine a car is coming. We haven't seen it, but there's still thought, car. But the conceptual mind also gets in the way of seeing the perception. We only see a conceived version. So we hear a car, and we might think, but then again, around the corner might come something else. Maybe it's a motorbike of some sort. But the thing is, the perception, the conceptual way of understanding the reality is not something that's necessarily valid. So Tsultrim Gyamtso explains, we're confused by the appearing thing. The conceptual mind takes what appears to it to be an outer object. The conceptual mind cannot distinguish between the image of an object that appears to it and the real external object. It takes them to be one. So that's again coming back to the snake. There's a moment of not seeing properly, and that's where what's the problem is we're not looking. That's where we impute then the thing snake, but in fact it's just projecting onto the object. So that's also where we need to look to see properly. Yeah. So pramana is the science of valid knowledge. This is a good key thing in Buddhism, and that's where it's tragic when Buddhism is relegated to say the notion that it's a belief system or something. It's a science. It's different from the science that we know, but it operates actually with the same demand for empiricism. Only thing is, it's about the consciousness. So it's a science around consciousness in its confused and in its awake condition. So here right now, then in the context of pramana, looking at what happens when our mind gets lost, then we are asserting what is valid, what's invalid. So actual perceptions of what is real, we call this specifically characterized phenomena. Conceptions of general abstract images, we call generally characterized phenomena. I'm a little bit inclined to go with an acronym, SCP and GCP. Let's see how we go. They're long words. Perceptions are real. Conceptions are not real. So the things that we're seeing, what is it? The cow, the book, yeah, they're real. There is an actual, there's an actual book here. But then we might discuss books, and that's where we're talking about things that in our mind exist, and they're very helpful, but they're not actually books. You can't pick them up and read them. So we need to distinguish between that, and that is where we sometimes have this thing that happens where we project. Khenpo Tsultrim Gyamtso says, a conceptual consciousness has both an appearing object, which is a generally characterized phenomena, and a referent object, which is a specifically characterized phenomenon. So that's why we would say, I see book, and there is then a referent object, and then that, of course, becomes the basis of what then is my notion around about books. So there is the referent object that is here, and yet when I then perceive of that, then I'm just thinking about it. So the conceptual consciousness, of course, takes its basis in some reality, but then what I'm operating with is more a generally, what we call generally characterized phenomenon. Problem is, it mistakenly considers the appearing object and the referent object to be one. It engages its objects through mistakenly considering them as one. And that's where my idea of snake, or the idea of solidly existing phenomena, which is entirely in my head, is projected onto phenomena. And that's where I begin to solidify things in a way that they actually don't exist. Look, again, coming back to the simplicity of this, we're just talking about believing in our projections. We impose our abstract ideas and things, so we don't actually see them. These abstractions may resemble the thing, but it is a vague image. It's something that we very often have in dramas, in movies or in literature, in stories and in life, that we are so caught up in our preconceptions that we don't actually perceive, let's say, the person or the situation. So of course we're thinking about something, but it's it's not actually, it's just ideas that are sitting behind us. And Karr says, when our conceptions resemble the specifically characterized phenomena they refer to, they can be extremely useful. All communication and abstract thinking depend on them. Often, however, our abstractions have little correspondence to the things they refer to. So we operate so much with communicating because we're talking about the plight of the modern cow. We're talking about vacation in a place where we were and so forth, and if you go back, and we're telling people about things that we have some experience, but they're generating ideas which might actually be helpful to them. So it could be very valuable, and that's how we operate when we sit and talk and so on. This is very often what we do. But we also need to realize how these are just in the realm of the generally characterized phenomena. But of course, these generally characterized phenomena, they are also referring to specific characterized phenomena, actual things. So in here then, and Andrew Karr gives us some, and I'm making it very short here, obviously. Let's see. Yeah. There's a long quote from Khenpo Tsultrim Gyamtso, which I hope is helpful, but I also did find that it might be a little bit, it might be not easy. Read it again and again. But it does essentially talk about this, the difference between the actual existing phenomena and the image that we have of these phenomena. That's what runs through the theme here. That's the theme of the chapter. And then at the end, he gives some exercises that we can do. Which is thinking about things that we like. And this, of course, is very real in terms of our experience, where we then think of the object, and then we think, is what I'm conjuring up in my mind right now, Is that a generally characterized phenomenon, or is that a specific characterized phenomenon? Is it the actual thing, or is it just my concept? Is it my projection? And that's where we can become very clear that actually the projection that we're putting onto it is really what generates so much of our passion about something. And the same also with an object of aversion. The last one is looking at the brain. And when we think about the brain, which we attribute so much value to, then the truth of the matter is that actually we're just talking about something that is entirely physical and which stands vastly apart from our actual experience of thinking and the experience that we have. And so we can very validly ask, is this idea of gray matter, for example, or frontal lobes and so forth, gamma waves and all of that, if this is something that is an actual matter that we can perceive and so on, and how much of it does exist as more generally specified phenomenon. And then Andy goes into then the whole discussion around the issue of consciousness, which pretty much is along what we were looking at before, which is that there is no real conclusion about that. And when it comes to the propositions about the mind in modern science, it's in no way backed up by anything empirically. There has been no understanding or identification of consciousness in any way. There's some propositions about it. There is some neural correlations where we can see the brain that gives out signals, but without an actual subject that tells us what is being experienced. There's an actual subject that then informs what is the specific characterized phenomenon. Without that first person informing it, these objective signals and so on, we could never know what they are. So the assumptions around the functionality of the brain operates within this very non-empirical level of the generally characterized phenomena. Now, one more thing then, and that is that obviously when we're talking about the generally characterized phenomena, concepts, they're helpful. So let's just be clear that we could appreciate them as intelligent and valid. And that's where one is that we have the direct valid cognition or direct perception of something. We see, for example, directly we see a fire. That's there. But then we also have inferential valid cognition, that we just see some smoke rising above the hill or coming out of a building, and we just see smoke pouring out. And then we can use that intelligently to infer, and that's intelligent, that there is a fire, and then we call the fire department. So we refer to inference as a valid way of knowledge. Incidentally, in science, nobody has ever seen an atom, but they can be inferred in terms of traces that are left in gases and so on. There's no actual direct seeing of atoms, much less talk about subatomic particles and so forth. So we operate with inference all the way through, and we do see that as valid science, as valid ways of understanding. So the valid cognition also is understanding things on the basis of, for example, emptiness. We can say, well, on the basis of seeing that there is no self, the notion of self is flawed. We understand the absence of inherent existence. That's inferred on the basis of valid cognition initially. Then someone who has realization, for them, this becomes direct perception. And that's where we then have a third category, where we talk valid cognition of yogic direct perception. And that's where the yogis, those with few obscurations, with realizations, see things that we don't see. I mean, sometimes we have the mysteries of lamas who have insights, or yogis who have insights, and so on. But actually, it's not that mystical. It's not miraculous. It's on the basis of cause and effect. It's on the basis of absence of obscurations, and particular clarity of disposition. For example, you also have mediums who see things, and they don't do so just miraculously, but just because we would say their energies and their channels and so on, all the conditions are there. And this is also with the absence of confusion and the perception, the realization of emptiness. We also talk about the valid cognition of pure perception. So this is also the foundation for the Vajrayana notion of deity, mantra, and so forth. Then finally, and of course these two, I put them in brackets because they're not mentioned, but good to know. And then lastly, we also do refer to scriptural valid cognition. We would refer to what the Buddha said as something that is, well, of course, need to verify it, but it is something that we listen to. We might not listen to some people, who clearly are not experts on a topic. But in the case of the Buddha, speaking on the mind and the nature of reality and so on, then we would listen to it. But of course, like the Buddha said, you should not accept what I say out of respect for my person, but on the basis of your own inquiry. But still, you will see very often what we have here, for example, is backing a statement up with some validation from scriptural source is viewed as a way of lending authority to some statement. That's general on what we call pramana, or modes of valid cognition. So just to round up then, specifically characterized phenomena exist as it is. This is absolute truth. So someone who practices the path more and more sees directly the nature of phenomena. On the path, we can use the relative truth to infer and approach, but the actual seeing is then the specifically characterized phenomena. That is then clear seeing, oh, it's just a rope, it's all good. That's the vision of insight. And so that's where the Buddha is free, through that. Generally characterized phenomena appear to the confused subject. And doesn't necessarily have to be confused thinking as such. It can be valid, as we saw, but it is still operating within a dualistic framework. It is what we call relative truth. So again, and this is an example of scriptural authority, right, as a validation, where we quote Dharmakirti in his what's called the Pramanavartika, the commentary on valid cognition. Here, what is genuinely able to perform a function is what genuinely exists. Everything else is seemingly existent. These two are explained as specifically characterized and generally characterized phenomena. There's something quite beautiful, actually, that Andy says, which is helpful, drawing on Trungpa Rinpoche. But Trungpa Rinpoche says, you're not, with the haikus and so on, not trying to say something enlightened. It's just coming from a place of just being very straightforward and honest with phenomena. But in doing so, you can evoke something very real. They end their flight, one by one, crows at dusk. Blow of an axe, pine scent, the winter woods. Lighting the lantern, the yellow chrysanthemums lose their color. A tethered horse, snow in both stirrups. How does your assertion that we cannot see atoms relate to the scientific claim that they can be seen with advanced electron microscope? Or maybe they can. All right. Okay, with the right equipment, we can see the atoms. Mind you, we'll still return to this issue because ultimately we're also going to say that atoms are not seen as what we call partless and absolute. They still have their parts, the ups and downs and so on. We had atoms, then we had quarks, now we had, Higgs boson and so on. So the notion of absolute is what we ultimately will be challenging. But indeed, if we can see atoms, okay, that's simply just I'm not up to date then with the latest. But anyway, the objects that we're seeing, that we are then observing, this is then what we are looking at as being something. If it can perform a function, yes, then for the Sotrantika, that's real enough. That's fine. But also what we have then is that we are imposing something on them. We'll be looking more at that. Yeah. I will miss the last session. Is there any way I can catch up with session 6? Look, in general, read the book. That's, what you're getting here is not a digest. And so this is really just hopefully something that helps you in your reading of this book. I'm not going to say exactly what Andrew Karr says, obviously, and I'm going to sometimes be coming in at a different angle, but I hope together this will constitute something that highlights the themes that are being treated in this work. And but as far as missing sessions, that's not a problem. The only thing is you might not get the video, but I don't think that's a major loss really. And all the recordings of the desktop here, what you can see on your screen, and also the audio will be uploaded to the Dropbox folder. So with the mails that you have received, then the link to the Dropbox folder should be there. Okay. All right. Next time, please read the chapters Mahayana 101 and the Chittamatra. There is only one mind. So now we're going into the Mahayana. And then some verse of dedication, which is from Nagarjuna. By this positive action may all beings perfect the accumulation of merit and wisdom and attain the two supreme kayas, which arise from merit and wisdom.